Hi, I'm Juha Virtanen. I'm a lecturer in contemporary literature here at the School of English at the University of Kent, and with me is Dr. Eleanor Perry, who is a lecturer in creative writing, also at the School of English here at Kent. And with the final season of HBO's hit show Game of Thrones upon us, we wanted to take a little while to not only talk about our own interest in that show and the books by George R.R. Martin that inspired it, but also to think about ways in which things that we find in Game of Thrones, whether it's the novels or the show, might intersect with and speak to things that we do in our working lives as lecturers here at the School of English. So we're really going to be thinking about ways in which Game of Thrones might speak to or overlap or intersect with a literature degree. And we have a series of cue cards that will be kind of taking our topics from and talking about them based on what each card says. And this one will be saying, the contemporary, my subject area here. Do you want to go first? Or?
Given it's your subject area, I think maybe you should.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways we can think about the show as kind of reflecting upon, almost sort of in an allegorical fashion, on things that we actually see happening in our world today. I mean, one of the kind of most obvious things that I'm sure I'm not the only person who's kind of thought this, and I'm sure there are lots of other writings about it, but it's the kind of way in which so much of the show's build-up in the preceding seasons has been about the kind of internal or external kind of power struggles around Westerosi politics or politics around the kind of marine and so forth, and so it's all been about kind of who sits on the Iron Throne and who's playing the Game of Thrones, and all of these things that have kind of kept us interested for all the years that the show has been running. Whereas in the kind of background of all this, the whole time we've seen the kind of the threat of the White Walkers kind of approaching, and the kind of the long night and the long winter descending upon Westeros that now, at the end of the previous season, finally arrived, and that's what we'll be kind of watching throughout the final series of the show. So for me, that kind of reminds me of kind of contemporary attitudes towards climate change, and in the way that this huge kind of climate emergency and climate disaster is already happening, already upon us. And if you look at the kind of the kind of political discourse that is around it, oftentimes that is not even not talked about enough, but entirely absent from what is being said.
And we are underprepared.
Yes, exactly.
We, in the same way that in the show they are cobbling together a motley crew of warriors to kind of fight this great battle, and in a way we are in a similar position. We are underprepared. And it's very much that resistance is very much taking place in the margins.
Yes.
With the sort of protests and resistances happening with young people.
Yeah.
And their marches and boycotts of school.
Yeah. So there's a kind of a way in which the real way of kind of trying to combat it in the show and in real life, we see it happening through grassroots activism as opposed to through any kind of bigger sort of geopolitical movements and agreements. And it is the geopolitical kind of and the political power structures that are shown to be ill-prepared both in the show and in our kind of life. So that's the kind of most obvious thing that I think of as kind of how Game of Thrones is, amongst other things, a kind of an enormously contemporary show. And we can elaborate on this in all kinds of ways and think about how the sort of so-called wildlings in the show would then be kind of mirrored down in terms of climate refugees, which are then and then we're kind of thinking about the wall,
in relation to the Trumpian
wall and the kind of the ideas around border crisis that we're seeing both in the US and the UK and in Europe kind of occurring right now. So we can kind of also then kind of entangle all of that into the kind of the contemporary kind of tapestry that's taking place in the show. But also, I mean, I guess in that kind of sense of these things rising from the kind of grassroots, these sort of marginal kind of bands of people coming together in order to try and kind of combat what's happening. Another thing that seems interesting to me in the kind of way in which the show takes place in a crisis, but in that crisis there is a kind of a promise of something new kind of coming through. So I'm thinking of the kind of ways in which the kind of other great fantasy kind of looks like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings ends with the magical beings kind of going away. You know, the elves leave Middle-earth, as does the wizards and so on, and begins the kind of the realm of men kind of thing. And that's the ending. But Game of Thrones begins at that point. Magic has disappeared and is now, during the kind of course of the narrative, kind of coming back. So there's this kind of bubbling away of, or kind of bubbling to the surface of something new kind of coming along, which, if we're thinking about kind of in its kind of contemporary things, could be an indication of something more hopeful in the future in light of this huge emergency that's facing us.
George R. R. Martin isn't well known for, you know, like, as we've seen with the beheading of Ned Stark in the first series, he's not well known for sort of easy narrative conclusions. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how he resolves this potential allegory for climate change in a satisfactory way that doesn't eradicate all hope.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of, I mean, he's for years promised a bittersweet ending, and I'm really interested to see what that bittersweet ending would be, given the kind of the enormity of the challenge that is being faced both in that world and in our own. Post-colonialism or post-colonial theory more broadly, what's your first thought?
Post-colonialism. Well, so the first thing that springs to mind would be Orientalism. The way in which certain geographies in the show are portrayed in a particularly exoticized way. I'm thinking particularly of the Dothraki.
Yeah, certainly. There's a kind of exaggeration of difference in the very first kind of moments we see those.
Yeah.
That particular kind of nation of people.
The way in which they're kind of portrayed in contrast to the Westerosi people as kind of barbaric and kind of we're introduced to them at the wedding of Daenerys, and it's all very kind of sort of savage and violent, and so you've got that sense of kind of the exoticized other.
Yeah, absolutely, and with that exoticized other, we also have this sense of the kind of a presumption of the kind of Westerosi superiority in comparison to the Dothraki, kind of underlying that as well. Yeah, absolutely. It kind of has many of the things that Edward Said would have talked about in relation to Orientalism, all present there.
And I think that kind of comes back to an idea of the way in which the show is set up via a particularly colonial gaze, in the sense that we are encouraged to identify with the Westerosi in the show, whereas the characters in the show who are presented as being from Essos, Bravos, Yiti, the Shadowlands, all of these kind of places in the show are kind of presented as an other, an exoticized other.
Yeah. No, it certainly has that going, but what's also interesting about that is the kind of way in which, if we sort of dwell deeper into the kind of the history of the mythology that has been kind of created around these books, the kind of current culture of Westeros as we find it in the books and the show is actually a result of migration from the kind of continent of Essos, because it is the Andals that kind of come from the north parts there, who then kind of end up changing Westerosi culture and introducing kind of a different religion, the faith of the Seven, onto kind of Westerosi lands.
It's all a story about colonialism, isn't it? So
exactly.
First, the Targaryen colonization of Westeros in the sort of big event that is always kind of the big mythos that is always called back to.
Yeah.
And then you've got the repetition of that in Daenerys' colonization of Slaver's Bay, Marine.
Yeah, as much as she comes there as a kind of a liberating force for the slaves, she's also coming with a kind of a colonizing army. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of these kind of different intersections that kind of blow through it, and we could even kind of pursue that further by thinking about kind of how whether there are ways we can think about the resistance that that kind of Daenerys meets in Marine as being somehow kind of related to a decolonial resistance in some ways.
Yeah.
But it gets quite complicated because of the questions of slavery that are kind of entangled with
Definitely,
them.
yeah.
Yeah. Shall we look at another topic?
Let's do that.
Okay, so the next one is feminist theory. How might that relate to aspects that we find in those books and the TV show?
I think this is quite a complicated one because Game of Thrones is a bit of a dichotomy in terms of feminist theory. I think that there are a lot of interesting and very empowered female characters.
Yeah.
So you've got, for instance, characters like Arya and Brienne and Yara Greyjoy or Asha Greyjoy in the books, all of whom are sort of subverting gender expectations,
yes.
the expectations of gender that are set for them within the parameters of the society in which they live. You've also got an awful lot of empowered female leaders.
Yes.
You've got Cersei, obviously incredibly powerful force in the story. You've got Lady Olenna, you've got Ilaria Sand. So there are lots of women in positions of power in the story who have agency and so on. But then there are other characters who don't have that. They don't have autonomy and power. You've got characters like Sansa, whose body autonomy is literally taken away when she's married to Ramsay Bolton. You've got the discussion of Cersei having her body autonomy taken away when she's married to Robert Baratheon.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you've also got that counterpoint of the way in which the show is, you know, arguably is designed for a male gaze.
Yes. In
its portrayal of violence against women as a kind of narrative hook, in its consistent use of full frontal nudity.
Yes.
So it's a little bit of a complicated.
Yeah, and like underlying that, all of that is that also the kind of sense that, you know, as much as we might have these sort of female characters who are shown to be empowered at points in time, the world of the books and the TV show is still unquestionably a heavily patriarchal, phallocentric society. So there's a kind of, again, as with the kind of conversation we're having with regards to post-colonialism just now, there's again a kind of there's not a straightforward way we can kind of think about it in that sense, because although we have this, it's complicated by other kind of facets that appear in the course of the show. And one of the things that I kind of find quite fascinating about the show is those moments of kind of subversion that happen. I'm thinking particularly of the kind of storylines that we find with characters like Arya, whose kind of characterization is almost defined by her constantly subverting the kind of regulatory gendered expectations that are kind of placed upon her from the kind of very beginning when we are introduced to her in the sort of pilot episode of the show, where one of the first things we see her do is shoot a bow and arrow better than her male brother. Then there's a kind of way in which that then kind of becomes a kind of a thread that around which her storyline kind of revolves entirely, is her pursuing things that the kind of regulatory ideals around gender might not kind of permit her to. So, and that I found has been quite an interesting part of the kind of the running of that narrative and story all the way through, and I'm quite excited to see how that will be brought to a conclusion in the weeks ahead. Yeah,
very exciting.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we need to kind of say about it, do you think, or?
I think, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think there is something interesting to be said about the way in which Game of Thrones portrays childbirth in relation to horror.
Yes.
So I'm thinking particularly of Melisandre and the shadow baby. That is produced as a means of getting rid of Renly Baratheon, but then you've also got what happens to Daenerys' baby, which is all kind of tied up with notions of dark magic and and the story kind of says that she is told that her baby is kind of born with bat wings, and
it's somehow being presented as less than human. Yeah.
So I think there seems to be like a kind of a pattern that gestures towards a notion, or like a strange correlation between childbirth and monstrosity, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because there's another kind of instance of quote-unquote sort of childbirth that we could kind of add to that, unless you said it and I kind of missed it, but there's also the kind of sense of Daenerys' dragons are talked about as her children, and that's another instance where childbirth, quote-unquote, as we see it happening there, is brought about by a kind of a moment of magic, because she walks into the pyre and the dragons are born in the fire that she and the dragons are kind of be able to survive. And I know it varies between the book and the TV show about whether this is a one-time thing, her kind of fire resistance, or whether it's a natural part of her kind of Targaryen lineage or something like that, because the show would indicate that it is something that she can do regularly, whereas the books would suggest that it was a one-off incident. But nevertheless, that's another instance where the kind of sort of an essentialized, gendered kind of notion around childbirth is somehow not just related with horror, but also with a kind of a moment of some kind of supernatural quality or magic.
Thinking about it, you've also got Cersei's interaction with Maggie the Frog, which is very much linked to her 3 children and their death. So you've got this kind of combination of motherhood, monstrosity and death that kind of is a pattern that recurs throughout the story, and I'm not really sure like exactly why that happens.
Yeah, no.
But I think it's an interesting recurring.
Oh, it's certainly there are enough of these things to kind of indicate that it is a pattern, but what that pattern means might be a question for a different conversation potentially. Yeah. So, Game of Thrones and Marxism, what would we say about that?
Okay, well, the main mode of production in Game of Thrones is feudalism.
Yes.
It's very much a kind of, what would you call it, an agrarian...
Yeah, I think,
agricultural situation where people pay fealty to lords. So you've got a feudalism, but it's kind of a feudalism that is in crisis. It's almost sort of in a state of breakdown, because you've got Tywin Lannister's gold has run out.
Yeah, and he's in debt as a result
to the Iron Bank. You've got wealthy merchants and slave traders who are sort of operating within a different economical framework that seems to be sort of gaining power as the show progresses. So it's interesting that you've got this kind of tension of modes of production that are
and it's kind of we're almost like shifting from one age of production to a different one, kind of as the narrative is developing, which is really interesting. I mean, this is kind of only, I guess, tangentially related to the topic, but one of the things that I've always found interesting about the whole world of Ice and Fire in terms of the kind of world building that George R.R. Martin has done as a part of it is the kind of amount of detail with which he even kind of includes economic questions as a part of how that particular universe is constructed. So I'm mainly, I guess, thinking about kind of not so much even the show, although it features in parts of it, or even the kind of books themselves, but some of the kind of supplementary material that Martin has written more recently. So I'm particularly thinking about, I read the Targaryen history book, quote unquote, called Blood and Fire quite recently, and one of the things that struck me whilst I was reading it is the fact of how many of the chapters just had these really quite long passages talking about the different kind of taxation laws that various Targaryen kings and their masters of coin were passing. And there's even a moment, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, where the people of King's Landing rise in revolt as a result of the kind of heavy-handed taxations that's been placed upon them by the Master of Coin, and during that rioting that takes place, they actually find and kill him. So there's a kind of a moment where we sort of have that, because economics is so firmly embedded into the world building, we actually kind of occasionally, not always, but sometimes we can kind of glimpse moments of what Marxist theory would talk about as class struggle taking place within the world. And I guess one of the ways in which it comes apparent in the show itself is through the kind of sparrows and the high sparrow that end up placing themselves kind of in opposition to the rulers of King's Landing in the kind of some of the latter series. It doesn't end up well for them, but there are moments where when the High Sparrow is speaking to, I think, Cersei, for example, he talks very much in similar terms and almost in similar phrases as, let's say, the current leader of the Labour Party in the UK, which I think is quite interesting to think about there as well.
So things like about the many and not the few.
Many and not the few, and that kind of idea, and then, you know, we are poor, but together we can kind of end an empire, and these kinds of phrases which sort of seem to be speaking towards some kind of a paused and stopped kind of proletarian revolution that was sort of bubbling away until the Sept of Baelor was blown up in one of the latter series.
But I think it's key to remember that the High Sparrow in the show is a zealot. He's a fanatic.
Yeah.
He's a fanatic who you know has to be stopped by being blown up with wildfire. So like I think you know there's something important about that. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's kind of, we could, again, as with the kind of some of the previous ones we've looked at, we've again kind of landed something where we've identified a particular pattern or a particular kind of motif that we could kind of analyze, critically interrogate, and theorize further. But it's sort of landed in another kind of complication. It's almost like there is, at times, quite difficult to kind of, the show seems to struggle, and I don't mean this in as a kind of a criticism, but there's a kind of a struggle in the show for it to kind of firmly align itself with a particular kind of position in terms of the kind of politics that are being articulated. And I think the fact that as much as there might be a kind of proletarian revolution bubbling away with the sparrows, the fact that they are being presented as zealots seems to kind of also then suggest
a kind of communism.
That's kind of a thing that they are almost, that narratively the show is uncomfortable about siding with fully, as much as there might be kind of indication towards, and that might say as much about our current political reality as it does about the political realities of Westeros, perhaps.
Well, we could say that it's part of the rich tapestry that George R. R. Martin creates, in that like he is quite good at creating a narrative that doesn't allow you to map black and white thinking on it. It doesn't allow you to come to an absolute position on anything. In a way that a lot of people I think have said is quite representative of real life. It's not easy to map things neatly in that way.
So it's kind of dealing with the mess of them as
the complexity of life.
Which I guess goes to what stands as a testament of the kind of the richness of the narrative, and why so many people across the world have been so captivated by it, perhaps. Right. Well, let's move on.
I think the first thing that springs to mind when we're thinking about queer theory or representation of sexuality and gender in the show would perhaps be the relationships between Renly and Loras Tyrell, and Loras and Oliver later after Renly has died, and the fact that these relationships are taking place, it's interesting that the show sort of presents them as tolerated, but not widely talked about. They're sort of accepted, but also frowned upon. So
there's a kind of a closeted quality to it.
I'm fairly certain that they are referred to by various characters behind the backs of Renly and Loras and so on, as kind of like a perversion or an unnatural relationship, which obviously creates some problematic questions about representation, because obviously on the one hand it's very positive that there are LGBTQ plus relationships being portrayed within the show, but on the other hand they are very much being presented in a heterosexist way, whereby this LGBTQ relationship is very other. It's very outside what is understood as normative. And we can also draw into that, I think, the bisexuality of Ilaria Sand and Oberyn Martell.
Yes, indeed.
Which again, you know, it's very positive that we've got a representation of bisexuality in the show. But on the other hand, it is very much presented as an exoticized... because we see it through the lens of the people living in the urban big city.
Indeed.
It's very much presented as something that is it's acceptable in Dawn, but it's terribly exotic.
And there's a kind of going back to what we were saying earlier, there's a kind of an othering that's taken place with regards to Dawnish culture overall. And the kind of the more... permissive kind of attitudes towards bisexuality that we find in Dawn are kind of embedded into that exoticized, othered kind of perspective there. Yeah, certainly. One of the things that seems to me interesting, I mean, again, this is sort of tangentially, I guess, related to what we're talking about, but it's also quite interesting to kind of think about the kind of different ways in which characters who have been kind of castrated are presented in the show, because we have Varys, the kind of master spy and of shifting allegiances, let's say. We have Theon, who changes entirely as a character once Ramsay Bolton castrates him.
Becomes completely submissive.
So there's a kind of a way in which with the kind of the loss of the phallus in these instances is frequently related with, again, quite problematic ideas around sort of effeminization and the kind of loss of quote-unquote masculinity as it's kind of understood in that, as you said, heterosexist kind of perspective that seems to inform the society in which
Theon completely loses his not just his power, but also his identity.
Yes, indeed.
He completely loses his sense of who he is.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a kind of a way in which the loss of phallus then amounts to kind of an entire erasure of the self, which raises all kinds of questions. But then as a kind of not necessarily a reverse of that, but a kind of a thing that complicates this, we have the army of the Unsullied, all of whom are castrated, but not nearly kind of as effeminized as...
quite the opposite.
As these previous characters.
Very masculinized. These are like warriors who can't be defeated. If anything, they're kind of presented as the epitome of masculinity.
Which then I guess kind of subverts those other expectations that are kind of presented through Varys and particularly through Theon. So there's again this kind of moment of, as you said before, that the books are dealing with complexity and doesn't kind of settle into an easy reading in that way. And I think there with those three kind of examples we see that happening again. Interesting. Let's see what we can find in the next card.
There's a lot of very interesting family dynamics going on here. There's a lot of sort of Oedipal dynamics. I think a very good example of that would be Sam Tarly and his father Randall, and the kind of Oedipal dynamic where obviously Randall wants his son dead. Samwell's very enamoured with his mother, and they kind of there's conflict between them that is quite Oedipal in its design. But I think there's something quite interesting about that sort of father-son legacy, this notion of kind of handing over the sword to your son as a kind of a phallic symbol.
Absolutely, which all of the great houses of Westeros do. They all most of them anyway, have this sort of Valyrian steel sword that's kind of passed from father to son,
but
all the way through.
Sam has to steal his
Yes,
swords.
yeah,
you know,
indeed,
so he's kind of stealing his like you know, whatever we might term that object, that phallic object. That represents kind of authority and power.
Yeah, indeed. As well as birthright, right? Because it's meant to be passed on to the eldest of the family, which I think Sam is, but he's being kind of disowned because he's given the option.
Feminized. I think it's because he reads books, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a kind of a way in which there's again a kind of a kind of a strike against that sort of paternal ruling in the act of stealing the family sword, as he does in one of the latter series. But on this notion, I think you're right about the kind of way in which the books are kind of, and the show is sort of, one of the kind of central gears that keeps the story going is these kind of complex family relationships. Because you sort of mentioned that idea of the kind of the Oedipal relationship between Sam and his father, but there's also a kind of an Oedipal tension between, say, Tywin Lannister and Tyrion as well, that kind of follows a lot of those similar patterns.
And let's not forget, obviously, that Tyrion kills Tywin with an arrow, which is another kind of phallic object.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of have those moments. But then we also have these moments, or kind of these dynamics of paternal or kind of family links being formed without kind of blood ties. So I'm thinking about the kind of way in which Sam Tarly forms, like almost kind of gets a substitute father through Maester Aemon at the Night's Watch, and in the same way as Jon Snow then kind of in the early series is shown to kind of find a father figure in Jorah Mormont, who is the Lord Commander, who has disowned his own biological son, Jorah Mormont.
So there's like a substitution, like a decathecting and recathecting.
Yes, So we could kind of entirely apply that sort of Freudian term of cathexis into these kind of other family relations that are formed through. And indeed, coming back to that idea of the family sword, Jorah Mormont gives the Mormont family sword to Jon Snow because he's not going to give it to Jorah, his biological heir, because he's been disowned. So there's that kind of a sense of these kinds of psychodynamic kind of relationships also kind of occurring across the show as well.